Hello everyone, and welcome back to our Bible study. Today we are in Psalm 17, which is a little bit longer psalm than some of the others that we've looked at so far, but not nearly as long as tomorrow. So today we have 15 verses, tomorrow we have 50 verses. I barely fit that one on the outline. We'll talk about our 50 tomorrow, Lord willing. Okay, so Psalm 17, who's the author? David is the author, once again, as we've seen several times already, and there are no New Testament references back to Psalm 17 that I am aware of. Our themes today, number one, although wicked men are in abundance, and there's plenty of them filling the world, God is a protection for those who walk in the paths of righteousness. The second theme, this psalm is going to contrast those who are entirely focused on physical, earthly life. It's going to contrast them with those who are focused on spiritual life and the resurrection. Two definitions also today. You might be familiar with these, but I thought I'd put them here just to make things as clear as possible. Number one, vindication. You find this one in verse 2 of the English Standard Version. Vindication is when a person is shown to be right after someone has accused them of being wrong. And definition number 2 is incline. We might say, I'm inclined to do something. To be inclined is to be willing and receptive to doing something. In verse 6, we have David asking the Lord to incline his ear to him and hear his prayer. So he's asking God to be willing to bend his ear and to listen to David's requests, his worship, and his thanksgivings. Okay, now for the outline. As I mentioned, we have 15 verses. The title for all 15 is Keep Me as the Apple of Your Eye. Maybe you've heard that, is it an expression or an idiom? I think it's an idiom. Keep me as the apple of your eye. That's what we've titled our chapter today. David called out to God to hear his prayer, and his prayer was a prayer of vindication. David believed that he was living an upright life with a pure and honest heart, and he believed that his enemies, who were troubling him yet again, were persecuting him unjustly. This isn't on the outline, but I thought of it just now, and that is that we've noticed that almost every one of these psalms that we've talked about, David's talking about his enemies. I was thinking, the Lord tells us that if we try to be like him and preach his message and preach the gospel, we're going to have enemies. So perhaps the more and more we grow into the image of Christ, the more and more we're actually going to relate to some of these psalms that are constantly talking about enemies, because the more enemies we will have, the more opposition we will have, the more we're like Jesus. Okay, so back to the outline. David begins this psalm by telling God that he's trying to live a moral life. He says that his eyes are fixed on righteousness, his lips don't produce deceit, not lying. He avoided the way of the violent, and his feet walked on God's paths. And he lived with a clear conscience, as he wrote, quote, "You have tried my heart. You have visited me by night. You have tested me, and you will find nothing." That's verse 3. He asked God to show his steadfast love to all of the people who looked for refuge in him. He says, quote, "Keep me as the apple of your eye." So if you ever wonder where that phrase comes from, now you know. "Keep me as the apple of your eye. Hide me in the shadow of your wings." Verse 8. They're like a mother hen, if you've ever been around ducks or chickens, or I'm sure other birds do it as well. Like a mother hen protects her chicks under her wings, David asked God to protect him from the wicked and violent men who surrounded him. He says that those evil men are like lions prowling around all the time, waiting to pounce on people and ambush people without any pity. It says they close off their hearts to pity. They didn't fear God, and they didn't fear God's judgment. And the reason for this is because they weren't focused on God. They weren't focused about the future, having to answer for the things that they did wrong. They were entirely focused on earthly life and how they could accumulate wealth for themselves, regardless of what they had to do to other men, or regardless of the disrespect and the blasphemy that they showed to God. The final verse of the psalm reads thus, quote, "As for me, I shall behold your face in righteousness when I awake. I shall be satisfied with your likeness." So again, in contrast to these evil men, David woke up every morning and he didn't go pursue wealth at the expense of other people. He didn't try to ambush, the weak and the helpless in the streets to get to promote himself for self-gain. No, every morning he woke up satisfied to walk in the righteousness of God and to walk in the likeness of God. Now, some people, including myself, I think, from studying this, believe that verse 15 also, or perhaps entirely, refers to life after death. So certainly David woke up every morning trying to live in God's commands, right? But is that really what he's referring to in this verse? I think probably not. I think he's probably talking about the future. The worldly men, the evil men, were focused on the physical world, but David was looking forward to a day when he could wake up in a new world. Death in the Psalms is often referred to as sleeping. He's talking about waking up in a new world, in God's presence, to see God's face in the resurrection, I think he might be referring to here, and to look on the face of God in righteousness, in heaven. So his focus was on the spiritual world, what was going to come next after this physical life, where the righteous were going to live with God in heaven, in righteousness, in holiness forever. I just wanted to introduce the two different ways of looking at that verse, and maybe you can dig into it more on your own. Let's talk about our application now. We generally want to think of ourselves as like strong, self-supporting, self-sufficient beings, not as weak, helpless creatures that need protection. But it's interesting that that's how the psalmist portrays himself in Psalm 17. And I think it's really important to keep in mind who the author of this psalm is and his accomplishments. So King David is the author of this psalm. And if anyone could have boasted in strength, in self-sufficiency, in victories, and attributed that strength to themselves, David certainly would have been tempted to do that. David slew giants. He killed Goliath. He led numerous armies to victory. Single-handedly, with his own hands, he probably killed hundreds, if not thousands, of men in battle. Or did he? Did he slay the giants? Did he lead the armies to victory? Did he, kill those men with the strength of his own hands and purely just his own skill and self-ability? I don't think David thought so. One of the really remarkable things about David, his life, his character, is that he always credited God for his victories, including the one that he had over Goliath. And he was right to do it because he won those battles on the strength of God, not his own strength. David saw himself as a small baby chicken running to God for protection under his wings. That's the picture of himself that he gives here. And if David saw himself this way, the mighty warrior David saw himself this way, certainly we should not be tempted to give in to the temptation to think too much of ourselves. We are baby chickens. We are sheep stumbling around in the pasture. It is the Lord who is the lion and who is the shepherd who protects the flock. And we need to be careful that we don't mistake his power for our own.